Okay. And we are live. Hey, everybody. It's Sean Murphy, the Executive Director of 1455. If you're just discovering this awesome series, the 1455 interview, welcome. And I'm happy to say that we already have, a couple of dozen in the can and a lot more coming. We're having a lot of fun with this. And it's a labor of love for me because I love a few things more than talking with authors and seeing what makes them tick. And I'm very delighted today to welcome Susan Rich, who is an awesome poet. And if you are not sufficiently inspired after this conversation, which you will be, you can check her out in the most recent issue of Movable Type, where she was kind enough to let us excerpt her poem, Song at the End of the Mind, which is taken from the anthology Alone Together, which I'll mention in her bio. So let me introduce Susan and thank her for being here. Susan is the author of 4 collections of poetry, including Cloud Pharmacy, The Alchemist's Kitchen, which is a great title, which was named for a finalist for the Forward Prize and the Washington State Book Award, and winner of the Penn USA Award for Poetry and the Peace Corps Writers Award. She's co-editor of The Strangest of Theaters, Poets Writing Across Borders, and not least, as mentioned, she was featured in the most recent Movable Type, which is taken from the incredible new anthology Alone Together, Love, Grief, and Comfort in the Time of COVID-19. I encourage everyone to check that out for her work and the work of several dozen other remarkable authors. It's an important contribution to our current events. Susan lives in Seattle and teaches at Highline College, where she runs the reading series Highline Listens, Writers Read Their Work. Susan, thanks so much for being here. It is a delight to welcome you to this series.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
All right, well, you know what's coming, so there won't be any surprises. I will set our timer, as always, for 14 minutes and 55 seconds, and we will be off. Susan, what's the first book that made you want to be a writer, or a book that changed your life?
Okay, well, I actually took a whole author's collection of work, and the name of the author is Edith Nesbit, English author who wrote adult books, but mostly children's books. And what I did in prep for this interview was I went back and thought, okay, which books were the ones that struck me the most? I found an interview with her. I found an article that talked about how she's incredibly famous in England. So some of the audience may know her, but because she deals in magic, that's her kind of number one area, that American librarians weren't quite as welcoming. And so in England, she's on the same level as Lewis Carroll. The book that I loved the most is called Wet Magic. And thanks to my Googling this morning, I realized it is available for free on the internet. And so I got to look at that and look at the illustrations. It's interesting to think about what I was reading at 8 and 9 and how much magic and imagination was part of it. So I highly recommend anything by her, but particularly Wet Magic, Enchanted Castle, 5 Children in It, The Phoenix and the Carpenter. I can keep going.
Well, that's wonderful for 2 reasons. One, I'm sure a lot of people will be discovering this writer. And also, one of the pro cons of this series is we keep adding to people watching, including myself, a list of books to read. So adding a free book, always welcome. So thank you for that. This is a tough one, but if you had to say, who's your most profound artistic influence?
Yeah, I came up with 3.
Good. List them all.
Okay, Elizabeth Bishop, for being one of the first huge inspirations for me as someone who lived outside the United States for a long time, someone who had a love of maps. A former teacher introduced me to her work because I was writing about maps already. The other writer who I keep going back to year after year after year is Rilke in the Edward Snow translations. I think he's one of the only writers of his time that we still go to and look towards fairly regularly. And then I like to keep it up to date. So the book that I keep going back to that's by my bedside table is American Sonnets from My Past and Future Assassin by Terence Hayes. I always find him wildly impressive and inspirational, and that book particularly right now.
Awesome. Great stuff. And I always love 3, when one answer will not suffice, Three is always welcome. And of course, I acknowledge and recognize that for writers, trying to list the one thing is impossible, but that's part of the fun of it. So these answers can always be changed at a later date.
Right. Ask me tomorrow, you'll get different answers. But I did like the idea of trying to do like early influences, kind of the one I go back to and my favorite guy at the moment. So you get three.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. How about an album or movie or both that you recommend without reservation?
Yeah, you got two for those. Yep. Still can't do just one. I
Right.
teach film. So film is sort of part of, I think it's part of American culture, but it's something that's really, yeah, I'm not going to claim it more than the average person, but I adore film. We'll just say that. And the two I chose, one is a film that I'm teaching right now, RBG, the documentary about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I think I've watched it a dozen times since she passed, and it just has more things to give. And it's really fun to be teaching that to my college students because they're getting super excited. It's not like any documentary I've seen. She wanted it to be an action movie, and it sort of is. So it's playing on Hulu right now for anybody who wants to see it. And the other film that, again, is something that is more sort of a classical obsession is Amélie, the French movie by Jean-Pierre Jeunet. And that movie just has every film angle, every switch, every trick, and it's beautiful. So why not? So those are the two that came to mind at first.
Two very positive and powerful female stories, which we're always in need of and could use. So fantastic. All right, this is a tough one, but I have a feeling you gave this some thought. How about a best, I won't say the best, first or last line of any book ever?
Yeah, this was one that I had memorized for a long time. I feel a little guilty that it's not poetry, it's prose, but it's by the writer J.M. Coccia, John Coccia, who I taught with when I was in South Africa. And I'll just read you the line so that you have it, and then maybe we can talk about it. Here's the line. And I did copy it down. I wanted to get it right in the moment. For his age, 52, divorced, he has, to his mind, solved the problem of sex rather well. It's the first line of his book, Disgrace. And I just thought it's so concise. There's so much information in there. There's so much tone in terms of like, oh, the problem of sex, it's all taken care of. The arrogance of the character. It's one of the only times I've read a first line, and this doesn't say anything good about me, I'm sure, but that I just had to keep rereading that line, that was like, wow, I've never seen a line do so much, the economy of it. And I thought the humor and the beauty of it.
Yeah, every time we talk about this question in the series, it's one of those, as a teacher, I know you deal with this all the time, when aspiring writers or readers want to understand, like, how does this work? And, the part of it is we don't know, but part of it is very calculated. And the idea is you want to intrigue and fascinate. And ultimately, right, on a very line by line level, you just want someone to keep reading. And a strong opening line is the best gift a writer can give themselves for a project, I think.
Before John Coccia was a Nobel winning writer and every other award that's out there, he was a mathematician. And I think his books in some way, because of the economy of the language, so work. He started out as a poet. I don't know that you can find any of his poems around anymore, but that was his first love. Mm-hmm. And I just think you can see that trajectory in his work and in his way of writing books. They're a little bit calculated sometimes, but there's also a real pleasure in how much attention. Anyway, I could go on. He's an interesting man.
Well, that's great. And that's the first time this series is young, but that's the first time he's come up. And it's always good to get a contemporary shout out. Speaking of shout outs, is there an underrated author that you would love to endorse or recognize?
Yeah, that was a tough one. I have two, a fiction writer and a poet. And, it's sort of like hard to say, like, I think they're underrated because most people I know don't know them, but they certainly have published well. So the first would be Helen Humphreys. Helen Humphreys is Canadian. She's written a number of novels. The one that I would start with is called After Image. And it's the I don't need to go into the story of it. I'll just say that she does incredible historical fiction. I considered myself someone who didn't like historical fiction. It was too mannered, it was too calculated. And yet her characters are psychologically complex. She also started as a poet. She's well known in Canada, where she's from, but I don't understand why she's not better known here. So After Image is one book I would say is amazing, and Coventry is another one. So read Helen Humphrey. She's pretty easy to get a hold of. And the other writer, maybe people will know. She had a book out I think last year, called Human Hours, Catherine Barnett. Catherine Barnett's an American poet, lives in New York, Grey Wolf writer, but I think she's underrated. I think it's partially because she doesn't have an internet presence. She stays off of social media. She's a pretty humble woman. And I think that's why people discover her and realize she's amazing. She had a poem in The New Yorker a couple of years ago called August Sun, and that easily you could Google and find and would kind of give you a sense of what she does. So Helen Humphreys and Catherine Barnett are my two picks.
Thank you for that. And I'm sure they appreciate the recognition. And that's part of our job, is to shine a light any way we can on writers we want to celebrate. So thanks for that. All right, my obligatory, very indulgent, half joking question. Why have you not read Moby Dick? Or if you have, is there a classic that you've been meaning to get around to?
Well, my answer to part A, two-part, no, I have not read it. And my answer to you is 2 male and 2 whale.
I can't hassle that response.
And as a New Englander, it was around me all the time. I couldn't get away from it. I, had to feel guilty that I hadn't. But 2 male, I wrote that today. I'm like, that answers it. That's it. That's what you got.
That's almost a T-shirt right there. 2 male, 2 whale. Is there a classic that you have been meaning to get around to?
So I often go through obsessions with different writers and read everything that they've done. I have not been able to get through all of Thomas Hardy's work. He was way too prolific. So I'm not sure if it's that I want to read a new one or if I want to go back and read some of the ones that I read and really liked in my 20s. It's probably time to a revision of that. Mayor of Casterbridge comes to mind. So Thomas Hardy, and to understand why he was so important to me when I can barely remember the books now, but I read everything I could find within reason.
Right on. Okay. All right. Focusing on the author at hand, would you be able to say that there's a single theme or issue that your work seeks to address?
The one that came to mind is quite simply, again, this could be a great bumper sticker or t-shirt, is staying human. And that seems particularly true right now, for sure, as we are on screens and alone often. But it also represents, I did human rights work for a long time before I taught college. I worked for Amnesty International. I was in Bosnia, South Africa, Gaza. And so kind of telling the stories of people whose stories often don't show up in American poetry, I suppose, was really important to me. I was much more interested in trying to make sense of a world that I was lucky enough to work and negotiate through than I was writing about my childhood. I don't think I even touched my childhood till I was maybe in my early 50s. So human rights, staying human, getting a broader understanding of the world. I did a project about the Somali Human Rights Network here in Washington. Seems to be something that I feel good about, that, does poetry matter? Well, perhaps it matters if it opens your mind to other cultures and other ways of being in the world. And that seems to be fairly consistent.
What a beautiful answer. Thank you. It's a very refreshing perspective, especially like you say, in our modern era, but even in 2020 in particular, staying human is a laudable. That is a good bumper sticker right there. Let's mental note. Let's work on that.
Yeah, I know. This is a whole other career for us. I didn't realize I had t-shirts and bumper stickers, but why not?
That's, we have to appreciate these things when they come to us, when they're least expected.
Well, I'll just throw this in. I taught in Zimbabwe years ago, and I said some offhand remark about how poets are kind of, setting themselves up for a life of not being particularly rich. And one of my young Zimbabwean students said, "Oh, no, miss, that's not the case. I've made a lot of money as a poet." I'm like, "You have? Well, tell me about it." And he had won the national contest for the phrase for the national airlines. And he'd come home with, "Welcome home to Zimbabwe." And that was, he felt, he'd made some money from it. He was a poet. He was super proud of it. I was like, I think that's advertising, but okay, we'll call it poetry. So I've always thought about him and thought, I wonder what happened.
Yeah. So there's the takeaway from this conversation. How do you make money as a poet? You write copy ads, right? Let's not even go down that road, but point taken. So I like to combine the next two questions because I think they're so interrelated. The notion of writer's routines, and do you have one? Do you believe in them? And or writer's block, and does one inform the other or neither, et cetera?
Yeah. So I'll start backwards. That's totally normal for me. I don't think there's such a thing as writer's block. I think, or opposite of that, is there's always writer's block. You're always looking at a blank page or a blank screen. So there's not really a sense that this week is worse than last week. But what I do to kind of counteract it recently, and this feels a little bit weird and a little bit revealing, and that's what you want from an interview, is I do a lot of poetry dates with friends. These are not romantic dates, but friends who are writers. And at this point, they're often Zoom dates. And we sort of have a regular, either once a week or once a month. We get together, we kind of catch up with each other's lives for a little while, and then we give each other prompts. And the prompt can be as simple as grabbing a line from a book and then tweaking it to change it. We use a lot of vocabulary lists, and we generate, maybe 4 or 5 starts. It's almost like you're doing the start for yogurt. You don't know what's going to happen to it, if it's going to work, but eventually of those 4 or 5 starts, those muscles keep going. And I found that doing that, they don't all work, never always will something, but if I get, one piece I want to work on from a session, that's fantastic. And it's so different than the writer alone in her room, struggling. It's like, we'll say to each other, "Did you get anything?" It's almost like we're fishing, right? And I'll say, "Oh no, I hate everything I have." And then, Kelly Russell Agadon or Elizabeth Austin will say, "Oh no, you really have something there. Look at it tomorrow." And, damn, they're right. If I just leave it alone for a little while, whereas if I was writing by myself, I might just toss it or not ever look at it again. So it's both here we are, we have 2 or 3 hours set aside to write, and then someone else telling you, or did you realize that's really about X? And okay, now I have a way to go with it.
Yeah. Another bumper sticker: use creativity to get creative.
Yeah.
I think we can have a little side gig we can explore. But listen, that is very consistent with what virtually every writer I've talked to has said, which is, of course, writer's block, however you want to define it, can or does exist. But the writers that get stuff done don't have the luxury to pay attention to that. You have to find ways to break through that. Otherwise, it's ultimately self-indulgent. You can't allow the blank screen to beat you.
All my students something's just happened to the voice here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're great now. Just for 1 second you went out, okay. But you're good.
Yeah, it sounded like my octave went up a lot. So basically my students are all telling me they have writer's block and woe is me, they can't write. I'm like, yeah, that's not going to happen. Just set a timer for 15 minutes and sit down. You'll get something.
Good for you. Good for you. Okay. How about a setback, artistic or otherwise, that ultimately helped put you on the trajectory that you found yourself on?
Yeah, that was easy to think about. I'll try to make this brief. In college, undergraduate, University of Massachusetts at Amherst, 2 different episodes with professors going out of their way, I hadn't asked, to tell me that I shouldn't be a poet. And, as a professor myself, it's mind-boggling, right? But, they were old white men, and for some reason they felt an affront that I wanted to write poetry. And it's not like I was a quiet kid. I would sit in the corner. I wouldn't speak a whole lot. I think I don't have any poker face. So I think part of the problem was that I was not particularly engaged by them telling stories about their sons. Anyway, so that was a setback when two different professors, went out of their, you should write children's books, one of them said, which I think would be great. I aspire to that, but they didn't mean it as an aspiration. They meant it as little girl, this is what you should do. Don't try to play with the big boys. So I didn't write. I decided that maybe they were right. I didn't like them much, but they were old white poets and I had to listen. And so it was over a decade until I wrote. I had been a creative writing major in college. I had really devoted myself to it in the way that you do when you're young. And then I was like, well, there's other poets out there that are much better. I guess I'll let them do the job. There were also only about 5 poetry presses. No, that's not true. There were 10 poetry presses in the country at the time, and I didn't see myself being published by those presses. So what brought me back to writing ultimately was being in the Peace Corps and living a life that kind of blew my mind on a daily basis. I still couldn't write much. I wrote some prose for the Peace Corps journal called the Camel Express. And then when I came home, I started after a number of years thinking, if I don't write about the Tuareg, if I don't write about the Fulani Wadabi, the US, people in the US aren't going to know these people. And I'm writing about people I knew personally. So, and that I didn't ever think I'd be published. I was like, I'm doing this because I like doing this. It makes me feel good. I could go on, but that's the brief story.
Well, so that was a nice roller coaster of a story, right? Like, it's so nauseating to hear about the bad old days, which isn't to say that doesn't exist now, but I think that's a much more common, these old white, stodgy professors. Thank goodness we're putting that further in the rear view, but also thank goodness you forced yourself to keep writing. We're all the better for it. So congratulations on overcoming what should not have ever happened in the first place. So that's a great segue to the next question, I think, which is, how would you explain or define what literary success means to you?
Yeah, community. The idea that in the bad old days, it probably meant a book from, who would have been a great, I'm blanking on the press that Sharon Olds works with. Anyway, there were a few different presses. You wanted to be part of those presses in the New Yorker, in the Atlantic. And that's what success looked like in the bad old days. But in the good old days, and again, my voice is breaking up, right?
For a second, you're good. You're good.
I think if you don't mind, I'm going to just take a second and plug in my computer because I think I forgot to do that.
Sure, go ahead.
And that might help.
Okay.
I'm still here.
You can even keep talking while you do that.
Right, viewers can see my books while I do that.
See, that's another, it's a free promo.
And who knows whether this will help or not, but it'll make me feel I've done my bit. So now what I would say is, sometimes I have to think about this and scratch my head. I do feel that I've been successful in that I teach creative writing to college students. I have a number of books. I run a writing retreat, a poetry retreat for women. I co-run it with Kelly Russell Agaddon every September. And I have poets in my life who I love and admire very much and who we help each other. So it's a community. It's not just about, I've written the most beautiful poem that in 200 years people will be owing and awing over. It's no, I get to live a life where literature is front and center.
That's a perfect, there's no such thing as a wrong answer to that question, but that's beautiful. I appreciate that. And of course, the notion of community comes up all the time in 1455's programming. So that resonates powerfully with me. And I think most writers would agree with that. The real joy comes from sharing the ups and downs and exposing others and just being part of that creative process. How about something you wish you'd known as a writer 10 or even 20 years ago?
I think I actually wrote something down for that. That you can be a writer in so many different ways. That's what I come back to. If I was still waiting for the New Yorker to publish me, I would still be waiting, right? Like, think if that had been my notion of success, I'd be heartbroken because here it is all these years later. So the idea that there's so many different ways to be a poet in the world. There's a book of essays by Denise Levertov that I had as a young woman, high school age, I think, called Poet in the World. And in some ways, I think that like imprinted on my brain. And I'll just tell one super quick story. My publisher for years was White Pine Press. And when I was in South Africa, when a press there was interested, and there was communication between those two presses. But when I finally met Dennis Maloney years after he published me, and I kind of asked him, like, what made you interested in my work? Like, have you read the books that you published? Because he's a man of few words. And what he said to me was that I was the only poet he'd ever had who had first approached him on behalf of another poet. And so when I lived in South Africa, there was a poet I adored, and I thought that she should be better known in the US. I could have used her today as an example, Ingrid de Kock. And so I had sent her work and really had, like, as if I was a free literary agent, and said how I thought he should really look at her work. And he ended up looking at my work. But that act of generosity, where I really didn't have anything in mind for myself, I didn't think about it. It wasn't pre-planned. But then to have Dennis say, nobody has ever done that, I'm like, huh. So I like to tell that story because I think more people should do that.
Absolutely. Again, full agreement here. And that is actually, well, I shouldn't say actually, it should be self-evident. And I'm sure you can imagine throughout this series and a lot of our programming, it's a recurring theme, this genuine notion of community and paying it forward, and the cliche be damned, the tide lifting all boats. Like, the writers, I think, that haven't figured it out, no matter what their level of success, if you're not sharing it and helping others, there's something very hollow about the whole enterprise. I think people lose sight of what made them want to be readers, much less writers in the first place. And it's that generosity and that joy of wanting to share and promote.
I did a reading for Salem State the other week from my home in Seattle. I was in Salem, Massachusetts, with Joseph Legaspi. And all of the writers in that area I know through January O'Neill, through the Mass Poetry Festival. And my students who were present, because they could also come to Salem, Massachusetts, the thing they were most moved by, they said, was the friendliness and the camaraderie between Joseph and myself, between us and the moderator who we knew. And it was just so interesting to have a young person's perspective where they expect us to be more competitive, uptight. I don't know what they expected exactly, but that was what they, more than anything they experienced, it was seeing that we were part of a community and that we were nice to each other. We kept complimenting each other's poems genuinely. So yeah, just to add on.
And I think that resonates and kind of sums up this whole conversation and what makes you tick, this whole notion of community and staying human at all costs. That's it there in a nutshell. Well, so on an ending note, how about a 1 to 2 minute exhortation for a young or beginning writer that's looking for advice?
I think that's what I thought I was giving before in terms of, well,
yeah.
Here's one. Don't listen to anybody who tells you no. Don't listen to anyone who tells you no. Listen to comments, listen to other poets, listen to the community of poets you bring around you, but don't listen to anyone who tells you that you can't do it.
Right on. What better way to end, Susan? I thank you for sharing your time with us, and what an affirming, soulful, positive discussion. I'm inspired by that, and it reminds me of why we're doing the stuff that we're doing, which is to inspire and encourage each other. And I'm delighted to say that this conversation is almost like a palate cleanser of sorts. So I remind you that folks watching, check out Movable Type issue 2. You can see Susan's poem. I want to make sure I get it right. Song at the End of the Mind, which is an amazing title. It's a great poem. You can see that, and hopefully that will lead you into more experience with her work. And then in December, for our author series that month, we're having a conversation with several authors of this anthology, Alone Together. So check out the 1455 site for that, and you can see more of this then. But for now, Susan, thank you for sharing your wisdom and your time, and it's greatly appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for all that you do. You're doing all the community work. You're bringing people together. You're making things happen. So I want to acknowledge that.
Well, I appreciate it. It's 100% a labor of love. And, you know, another cliche, but kind of consistent with our discussion, you know, everyone says when you're younger, find something that you love to do and do it. It doesn't feel like work. There's a lot of truth in that. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, but, you know, writing, being around other writers and trying to lift up the creative process, which can be so solitary and lonely and full of rejection, is the least I think many of us can do to try to be as positive as possible. But I appreciate that recognition, and I look forward to sharing the stage with you again soon.
Yeah, see you in December.
If not sooner. All right, Susan, well, be well, stay healthy, and keep writing.
Thank you. You too.
Okay.
Bye-bye, Sean. Thank you.
Bye.